The brain doesn't have access to what's actually going on out there. It has access to a very sparse set of stimuli or signals, an organ that constructs hypotheses, fantasies, explanations that best explain what it's actually sensing. I keep using the word fantasies because the brain is a really fantastic organ. It is a purveyor of fantasies, those fantasies that are good enough to explain all of this data to which we expose ourselves.
Today, I am speaking with one of the most influential neuroscientists of our time, Professor Karl Friston. Karl is best known for developing the free energy principle, an idea that attempts to explain something incredibly ambitious, what all living things, including our brains, are actually trying to do. He's the most cited neuroscientist in the world. His work underpins modern theories of prediction, perception, learning, and even consciousness, and he's one of the few people whose ideas are being explored not just in neuroscience, but in psychology, biology, robotics, and AI. But what I love about Karl is this. Behind all the mathematics, he's ultimately trying to answer very human questions. Why do we feel anxious? Why does the world seem predictable one moment and chaotic the next? What makes us curious? And what is the mind really doing all day? Today, my goal is simple: to help translate Karl's extraordinary ideas into language we can all understand and to explore what his work means for our everyday lives. Karl, thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for that great introduction.
Just before we clicked record, I mentioned I'm in Sri Lanka, but about 4 minutes before hitting record and you turning up, there was a scorpion in my office. There were suddenly like locusts or bugs all over the place. So never quite know what every interview is going to involve. I once did an interview, and about 3 minutes before recording, I heard a scream from the next door room, and there was a cobra in the next door room. So let's see what happens during the course of this interview.
I have noticed little things flying around your head, which is charming.
Yeah, so this, if you suddenly see little bugs, I mean, we're now down to about 11 in the room. There was about 45, and so I've tried to block up all the cracks in the windows with pillows. So hopefully during the course of this interview, I'll either disappear from bugs or I figured it out. Through your research and your discovery, what is the brain actually trying to do all day?
What is the brain doing? Well, it looks as if it is in the game of making sense of the world in terms of what caused the sensations that the world delivers us, and bearing in mind that the brain doesn't have access to what's actually going on out there. It has access to a very sparse set of stimuli or signals that come from our sensory organs, and the important sensory organ would be our own body. So it only has access to very sparse sensory evidence for things that are actually happening beyond our brain-bound skull. And why does it have to make sense of things? Well, in order to couple back to the world, to act, and that action can be many modalities. It could be moving with our muscles, with our motor system, but it could also be sort of a homeostatic kind of action, an autonomic, controlling our heart rate or controlling our gut. And also there's also action on the inside in terms of what we attend to, what we ignore, and what we attenuate as opposed to select for processing, for this kind of sense making. How on earth does the brain make sense of the lived, or at least the sensed world? And most of the maths and most of the sort of philosophy centers on the notion of being able to predict the brain as an organ of predictions, a statistical organ, an organ that constructs hypotheses, fantasies, explanations that best explain what it's actually sensing, much in the same way that a scientist will bring to mind hypotheses to explain some empirical data that she has elicited by experiment or is available to her. So this process interestingly contrasts with 20th century views of extracting information from sensory input, and so classifying objects, for example, in a way that Andy Clark would describe, or Neil Seth would describe, as sort of an outside-in thing. This is a much more constructive inside-out process of generating fantasies, hallucinations, illusions that would be apt to explain away or to explain the sensory barrage that that we expose ourselves to. And I keep using the word fantasies because that licenses the notion of the brain as a really fantastic organ. It is a purveyor of fantasies, those fantasies that are good enough to explain all of this data to which we expose ourselves. And I also use the phrase expose ourselves just to emphasize that this is a very inactive process. We're not just sitting here as sessile creatures ingesting information and trying to explain it like a computer. We're actually in charge of the data that we gather. So we come back to this inactive or active aspect of sense making, that not only do we have to make sense of the data, we have to choose very, very carefully the kind of data that we go and gather. I noticed in your introduction, you sort of highlighted sort of two really key themes. One of them was curiosity. Curiosity just is a description of the kind of thing that enjoys or looks as if it is seeking data that resolves its own uncertainty, makes the world more predictable from its point of view. And I think that's a really important aspect of this inactive aspect, coupling the brain back to the world through our body, through our muscles, through our autonomic nervous system.
A day ago, 2 days ago, I was going back and forth with some of the different AI chatbots, being like, explain this to me in a metaphor, explain this to me like I'm a kid, explain this to me using this type of thing. And one of the examples it gave, and I don't know how accurate this is, was this idea of this detective who is, rather than just passively waiting for the information or the evidence to pop on their lap, it was out investigating, finding clues, and it was that idea of activity. It was participating in the world. It was taking action.
Well, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I've never used that. I think the detective metaphor is absolutely perfect. And as you say, it does make it clear we have to go and gather the evidence upon which we sort of, draw our conclusions about who done it.
I'm Joe Blogs. I'm walking down the street. I'm just going about my life. Why does this matter for me? Why, my brain is constantly predicting the future. Why does this matter? For example, you're at a party, there's 200 people in the room, and suddenly you hear your name, or somebody throws a ball at you and then you catch it. I'm walking down the street and there's traffic coming everywhere. I'm at a busy intersection. Why does my brain constantly predicting the future? Why does that matter for me just going about my life? Why is this so important for humanity, our survival, that we're constantly predicting the future?
If you understand the mechanisms that underlie motivated behavior, intentional behavior of the sort we've been talking about. I'm not talking about sort of life plans, having children or, changing jobs. I'm talking across all scales, right from millisecond to millisecond, eye movements and homeostatic reflexes, very, very subpersonal, right through to long-term life plans. So this kind of prediction is operating all the time, everywhere, all at once. But if we understand the mechanisms, then we can also understand mechanistically when it goes wrong. And I'm saying that now as a psychiatrist or a psychologist would express this. So if we know how we work, then in principle, we can now understand what happens when we don't work. Prediction, when cast as the action of a detective making inferences about, his hypotheses about it, did she do it or did he do it or how was it done, is literally making inferences. That means that just being entails inferring constantly. You've described in terms of prediction about the future, and that's probably possibly one of the most important aspects of inference. Basically, inferring what am I going to do next. So, if I am active, if I'm an embodied, situated thing that actually moves and engages with the world, not only do I have to infer the state of the world in which I'm currently operating, establish my situational awareness, I also have to infer what I'm going to do next. And that means I have to make inferences about the future because I haven't yet done it. So now you can talk this about prediction as this anticipation and inference. And if I can boil everything sense making, perception, and action down to what I'm going to do next, then I can now understand people with, say, psychiatric disorders and some neurological disorders as some kind of failure of inference. And furthermore, if I understand the mechanics of it, I can also now try to intervene, remedy, think about therapeutic targets, or at least provide an explanation as to why somebody is experiencing the world in the way that they are experiencing this world. And by failures of inference, I just mean inferring something is there when it's not there, as somebody might do if they were suffering from a psychosis and or a psychotic break and were having hallucinations, or inferring something is not there when it is. You can see that quite commonly in psychiatry in terms of dissociative syndromes, used to be called hysterical syndromes, neglect syndromes, people who just do not, are unable to be aware of one side of their space or one part of their body, for example. Anorexia, false inference about one's body. So that would be another reason why this matters. It probably doesn't matter to Joe Bloggs walking down the street as a neurotypical person, but it might matter quite a lot to you if you had a mental illness or were exposed to the products of aberrant inference in this sense.
Making predictions in error. So we make a prediction and that becomes a false prediction. Anxiety, for example. If we are making faulty or incorrect predictions, is that almost like you have a weather app or weather forecast and it is incorrect. So it's saying every single day it's going to storm, every single day it's going to storm, and that's actually a prediction error. And so clearly it's faulty. And so in a similar way, our head, our brain, we are making incorrect predictions about our state, our environment, life. Is that analogy correct?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm going to have to remember this. We've got the detective and now we've got weather forecasting. These are perfect analogies. Absolutely. Yeah. So let's just take the weather forecasting app and that weather forecasting app can go in one of two directions. It can either give you very, very confident predictions, which are completely wrong, or it can give you predictions, but it's incredibly uncertain about the long-term future. So it will just tell you what's going to happen in the next half hour and won't give you any further information. So those are two ways in which, a weather forecast could fail you in some sense. And that would lead to different kinds of pathology. And I think that certainly the second kind, where your weather forecast basically renders you or leaves you very uncertain about the distant future, can very easily be associated with anxiety and negatively valenced emotional states. The interesting one about you've got very precise beliefs. Well, actually, let's assume that there was a magical weather forecast that was actually able to roll out weeks or months into the future with a degree of veracity, and it always told you that it was going to be dangerously stormy, and that you should not venture outside your house, because I can assure you that for the next 3 weeks, if you go outside, you're putting your life at risk. So I'm going to believe that. I'm going to stay inside. So what I'm talking now is not if like a model of anxiety. I'm talking about a model of agoraphobia or possibly withdrawal of the kind that comes along with depressive mood disorders, a social withdrawal. And the problem with that kind of false inference, that kind of false forecasting or false prediction, is that you preclude yourself from gathering evidence that this prediction was wrong. Because I'm now sequestered inside my home, I never go outside to find out, in fact, it's quite sunny. It was perfectly safe to go out. But because I don't know that, I remain convinced, effectively stuck in a rut, literally a free energy minimum, whereby I have these very precise false beliefs that it's dangerous to go outside. And if you now sort of translate that metaphor into sort of going out into a social world as opposed to a meteorological world, you now have quite a good metaphor for depressive withdrawal behavior. And indeed, at a sort of non-psychological level, you could also associate this with having Parkinson's disease. If I can't move, then I've got no evidence against the hypothesis that I am unable to move, and I don't move. This is if you like, an anthropomorphic interpretation of what is going on at a very low neurochemical level in Parkinson's disease. But the maths is exactly the same. But the anxiety is really interesting, because if it's the case that everything that I do is predicated on some belief about the consequences of my behavior, and if that belief is equipped with an uncertainty, then that means I will have an uncertainty about what to do next. And literally, we simulate this mathematically, and we can simulate little decision-making creatures making choices, and you can see them in a state of uncertainty. So if you've got some faulty forecast, which means that you now don't know what the outcome of pursuing this path of action or this plan or this policy, and you're uncertain about the consequences, then you can't disambiguate between what to do next. And that basically leaves you in an awful situation. You just don't know what to do next. You have a high degree of uncertainty over your beliefs about different courses of action. And almost universally, that's usually associated with a very negative affect. And, it could be argued, indeed some people do argue, that this is a state of anxiety. It's not having any clear path forward, because there's been a failure to resolve uncertainty about your future. And it's your future, it's private to you, because it's conditioned upon the things that you choose to do. And, if you had a brain that was able to recognize that you've got this profound uncertainty that is private to you, then you'd probably recognize, oh, I am in a state of anxiety. And if you're in a state of anxiety, you're going to say, okay, there must be a reason I'm anxious. I'm going to have to prepare myself for a flight or fright response. Therefore, I'm going to now deploy actively the normal response to being in a state of anxiety. So I'm going to accelerate my heart rate. I may have some postural freezing. And that's going to provide further evidence that I'm now in a state of anxiety. Which you can see as a sort of William James vicious circle, or possibly virtuous circle, all started just because I was uncertain about what to do next.
If somebody's listening to that and they struggle with decision fatigue or overwhelm every year that goes past, the amount of data coming at us is increasing. So many people are inundated with sensory data, ideas, decisions. How does one reconcile that, or how does one ease that burden?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it speaks exactly to our tendency to resolve uncertainty. And part of resolving uncertainty, part of being curious, is knowing where to look. And I think what you're articulating is a real problem faced by us, in the past few years, or you could argue the past decade or so, because now there are so many sources of evidence that you could forage. There's a real pressure to select that which you would imbue with some epistemic trust. So for example, the notion of fake news has now become endemic. It's, it's increasingly difficult to identify those sources of information, those sources of evidence that do afford you the information gain that, comply with this, fundamental or foundational imperative to resolve uncertainty that makes us curious. So just having more options open is one really, really simple and, to my mind, potentially very dangerous way of increasing the uncertainty about what to do next. So, just having all of these options is itself inducive of a negative affect, an uncertainty, a loss of self-confidence in what to do next, just because I've got more choices. I mean, this style of thinking, you see it emerge in many, many different contexts, right through from how people manage their social media through to simple pragmatic marketing. How many different kinds of tomatoes do you offer somebody in a supermarket? Is it a good thing to have a wide range? Well, no, it's not. The greater the range of tomatoes you have available, the more uncertain about what you're going to do in terms of picking that and taking it to the counter. There's some really interesting technical arguments about, how we not only interact with each other, but how we sell ourselves or our tomatoes to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you use that example because somebody who I've had on the podcast a couple of times, like 8 years ago, and we've recently had him back on, is Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice. And it's this idea why more is not always more and more can sometimes be less. And actually, when you use the example of tomatoes, when you go to the supermarket and there used to be 3 jams, strawberry, blackberry, or apricot, and now there's 75 different jams. He's like, how do I even make this decision? It's overwhelming. And so, I love that you kind of went there. If you had to explain the free energy principle to a curious 7-year-old, how would you do it?
I think surprise is probably the simplest way of capturing the essence of this. So the free energy principle just says that anything that is organizing itself in relation to some world can be described as minimizing surprise at many different levels. And then you can talk about how can you measure surprise? Well, you can measure surprise in terms of the mismatch between what you predicted and what you're actually faced with.
Story and reality. So, for example, I'm making a prediction, then you interact with the world, and then you get the evidence. Oh, spot on or off. And so that gap between how I think things will be, how things actually are, that space between is either correct prediction or prediction error.
Absolutely, yeah. It's exactly the mismatch, the gap, the distance between the reality or the sensory reality that you're actually sampling and the predictions, the story, the narrative that you bring to the table in order to predict that. Absolutely. So if there is no gap, I'm not surprised. If there's a big gap, then I am very surprised. How can I close that gap? Well, there are 2 ways of closing that gap. I can either change my mind to make my story, my prediction, closer to the reality that I've actually sampled, and that will close the gap. But there's another really interesting way of closing that gap. I can actually look somewhere else and get some new reality, some new data, search out some new evidence that is closer to what I predicted. So you've got these 2 ways of closing the gap, minimizing the prediction error. We can either change our mind, and when you grow up from your 7-year-old status, you will learn that this is called perception, or I can act upon the world to sample the world in a different kind of way to elicit messages, the reality from the world that is closer to my prediction. So I can close the gap either by changing reality as it's sampled, as it's lived and experienced by moving, by asking questions, by changing the world, literally by engineering it either socially or literally becoming an engineer and building bridges, for example. Or I can change my mind, change my brain so that it now adjusts to that reality. And that balance basically explains the way that we provides an apt explanation for much of our behavior.
What about denial?
Well, denial is an interesting way of closing the gap.
Not looking, it doesn't exist, or cognitive dissonance, or something when I'm just like, I'm going to recreate how I even perceive this event. So I am actually a good person in this situation. I didn't just whatever.
Well, no, I mean, that is a perfect example of active inference. Interestingly, let's not forget, because there's a 3rd way that you can close your eyes, which is by ignoring something. When we get into the world of wishful thinking and sort of personal or subpersonal mechanisms that we have for ignoring stuff, which is really important to act. And we can come back to that in a second if we have time. And I love this example about closing my eyes. So that would be a perfect example of changing your sensory input to close the gap. So imagine I'm a child and I do not expect to see another child traumatized in some physical way. This doesn't happen. So if I anticipate that is going to happen, then I can simply hide. So that is a very active way of controlling the sensory evidence at hand. It's just not there. So, it may not be, have, if you like, an evolutionary advantage to ignoring an approaching predator, but it does have, this is exactly the kind of behavior that complies with these more fundamental imperatives to minimize surprise. And then you have to learn to avoid the tiger, and you have to be told that tigers are dangerous. You have to be told how to cross the road. But that instinctual resampling of the world by closing your eyes or covering your eyes at a horror movie, or at the point that you anticipate that you will see something awful. But if I'm the kind of thing that does not expect to be surprised by gory scenes, gory visual input, then I can simply not look anywhere and close my eyes. So I think it's a really, a really lovely example of this mechanism in action, in children, and indeed, of course, even when we're adults, sometimes avoiding looking at really difficult stuff, or for example, my wife now often has to walk out of the room during the news at 10 just because it's just so much awful stuff going on. One way of making the world more predictable, less surprising and upsetting is just to ignore it.
Just to anchor this, maybe this is implied and maybe this is obvious to people, but maybe it's not. So when we talk about minimizing surprise, the importance of our brains trying to minimize surprise, does this all comes back to survival? Because it's like, I guess some people might be asking, like, why? So this idea of homeostasis, and correct me if I get any of this wrong. So homeostasis, we have this underlying biological driver for an organism is to stay within a narrow range of states required for survival. So, for example, proper temperature, nutrient levels, and the way it stays within these narrow range of states required for survival, its tactic, you could say, is minimizing surprise. So minimizing surprise equals safety, survival. When we interact with unpredictability, when we interact with things not going to plan how we predict, then that is existential risk on an evolutionary basis. If we are thinking, oh, there's no saber-toothed tiger over there, and our prediction is wrong, okay, we're out of the gene pool. And so us being able to understand, control, interact with our environment in a predictable way allows us on an existential level to stay alive, to survive. So this is why it all comes back to survival. Is that correct, or did I get any of that wrong?
No, that was very correct. And just revisit the homeostasis example. That's exactly the kind of gap closing that I was trying to describe to the 7-year-old. So this gap doesn't have to be sort of propositional beliefs or something that you can talk about with your friends. It can be very, very physiological and very, very basic. So if there's a gap between what I sense my temperature to be and what I believe it should be, my prediction of my temperature, then I can close that gap in one of two ways. I can either say to us, oh, I've got a fever, and I might take remedial action. I might take some Tylenol or paracetamol or try and cool myself down with ice. Or I can not change my mind and just say, no, I predict myself to have an absolutely normal temperature, and I'm going to act. How am I going to act? Well, I'm going to shiver, or I'm going to change my autonomic nervous system in such a way that I am now going to reduce my temperature. Sorry, shivering may sound too cold, so closing the gap the other way. So I'm too cold, so I can actually act without even knowing that my predictions were wrong. So I can act autonomically and autonomously through my physiology, through my homeostatic reflexes. So just the homeostasis just is this gap closing mechanics in action at a very, very low level. As we get more sophisticated and have better, if you like, long range weather forecasting about our bodies, the weather of our bodies, for example, we move from something called homeostasis to allostasis. So now let's pretend that I am cold and I have this prediction that I should be at this nice warm temperature. And I also sense myself to becoming progressively colder and colder and colder. Now, I could act immediately and start shivering and have induced piloerection, have my hair stand on end. Or I can now turn on a heater or go indoors or put on a coat. And that means that I have recognized that I am cold, and now I'm taking some long-term action to remedy, to close that gap preemptively to stop myself getting any colder. So that's not the sort of thing a thermostat could do. I mean, all of this maths applies to a thermostat. A thermostat has this kind of homeostasis, but you and I have much deeper, forward-looking, forecasting kinds of generative models or sentience that allows us to look much deeper into the future and ask, what would happen if I did that? And if I did that, could I now close the gap in a still an active way of closing the gap, but it's a way of closing the gap that is much more sophisticated. So it's now avoiding going where tigers are, as opposed to just freezing when you see a tiger. But it's all about gap closing. It's all about minimizing surprise. It's always describable as minimizing free energy. And those things that can do that, they exist. They exist from generation to generation. They exist from day to day. They exist from over evolutionary time, simply because they are minimizing their surprise. There's one interesting twist on this, which this gap, this surprise, has a complement. It's mathematically exactly the same as the negative or the inverse evidence for your models of your world, which means that to be curious and to close the gap actively in the various ways that we've been describing can also be described as gathering evidence for your models of the world. So this is, I think, a nice way of describing what it is to be curious, to, almost to the extent it's not simply that curious things live longer. It's if you live a long time, you must by definition be curious, be what some people in philosophy call self-evidencing, seeking evidence for your own existence. So if you spend your entire life walking down the street as Joe Bloggs, seeking evidence for your own existence as a model of your lived world, then you will live for much longer.
Polarity, or I guess contrasting desires. When a child feels safe and the caregiver is within eye's reach, then because of that safety, then they have more freedom to explore and explore danger or explore the new. With that in mind, if so much of what we do is to try to minimize surprise, how does that work with, for example, some people's enjoyment of an unexpected gift or a surprise birthday party? For many people, that would be categorized as a positive experience. How is that a contradiction, or is it not?
No. Again, wonderful example. In the lottery, that would be quite surprising, but something I wouldn't. So how do you resolve that? It's very simple. We've actually rehearsed the answer already. When we act to minimize expected surprise. So we are in search of information, which means that we are in search of, we will act in a way that resolves uncertainty about the gift that has been given to us. We will unwrap it. What have they bought us? Because they are offering us an epistemic opportunity to resolve uncertainty. What have they got us? So all of this, the minimization of surprise by acting is always understandable in terms of novelty seeking, information seeking, resolving uncertainty. So when people talk about nice surprises, what they're talking about is the opportunity to resolve uncertainty, either about yourself or the gift at hand, or who's going to win this football match, who's going to win this election. These are all listening to jazz music. These are all opportunities to act in a way, to listen actively, to vote, to unwrap your present, that will resolve uncertainty, which is this expected surprise. This is always in the context, of course, of avoiding surprising outcomes, where surprising outcomes are just uncharacteristic of you, like being very, very cold, for example. So there's always this sort of dual constraint. So when we talk about closing the gap, we're talking about closing the gap in the moment. When we're talking about choosing the actions that will enable us to close the gap on average, we're talking about curious, information-seeking, epistemic behavior. But I love that example that you gave from attachment theory, and the styles of attachment that, with certain good attachment styles, the child will certainly, when the mother is in sight, go off and play and explore. That doesn't always happen if you don't have the right kind of attachment to your mother. But in the normal instance, it will. And that reminds me very much of sort of the imperatives for emotional behaviors of the kind that, say, Panksepp would have brought to the table. This drive to care, this drive to seek, the drives to play. These are all, I think, expressions of curiosity. They're all expressions of information seeking, exploring in one kind of way, whether it's exploring with conspecifics, other children, in a way that sort of resolves uncertainty about how to interact with other people and play with other people, or whether it's just seeking, exploring, looking for resolving uncertainty about your local environs. But notice this expression is under constraints. It's under the constraints that it would be very surprising if me as an infant was not in the secure presence of a carer. So I'm not going to explore to the extent that I'm now in the very surprising situation of not having mum in sight. So I will explore under the constraint that I don't surprise myself in a fundamental way by being deserted or abandoned or lost, which would be horrifying, nightmarish.
You've used the phrase, you said resolving uncertainty, curiosity, exploring, seeking. In light of what we've been speaking about, how or where does autonomy come in? This desire to control our environment. How important is that in this minimizing of surprise, resolving uncertainty, curiosity? This idea that, for example, surprise, you got the gift, and this sense that I can choose to open my gift, or I can choose to do this, or I am the master of my own ship. I have some sense of control of my environment. How important is that?
I think it's very important. I mean, if you just read it in a very simple way, a sense of control is basically having a very confident belief about what will happen if I do that. So we're right back to the sort of the opposite of anxiety. So if you have a sense of control, that simply means you are fairly certain that if you do this, then that will happen. And you have sometimes engineered your world. It may be your social world, it may be your economic or political world, or it may be an educational world, such that the consequences of actions are always very, very predictable. So you are in control. And that is exactly the opposite of being uncertain and anxious or having some sort of angst about, what are you going to do next? So I think the drive to autonomy read as putting yourself in a situation where the consequences of your action are predictable and or the other people's actions are predictable, I think it is just an expression of exactly the same thing. It's the other side of the coin. Notice you're not controlling people in some malevolent sense. You are just trying to act upon the world and co-construct a world that offers you the least gap or surprise in the moment. In fact, you could even argue that language is an emergent property in this process of surprise minimization when you realize that your world is comprised of things like you. And if you are like me, then you are going to be wanted to render your world as predictable as possible to resolve uncertainty. And indeed, your curiosity is, if you like, the manifestation of this tendency to resolve uncertainty, maximize information gain. So how can we render ourselves mutually predictable? If we converge on the same world model, the same generative model, the same understanding of the world through discourse, then ultimately I will be able to predict you and you will be able to predict me. So now what we're talking about is the emergence of an importance of a theory of mind and the ability to take perspectives, and also a convergence. And if in the context of language, for example, a cultural niche construction that is simply a result of all the members that are co-constructing this particular cultural niche, say language, or writing books, or making films, or creating podcasts of the kind that we're doing now. Or this is all depends upon, or is always a reflection of our drive to be good detectives, our drives to be good scientists, to resolve uncertainty, to render the world as predictable and understandable and controllable in this benign surprise minimizing sense.
Why do people stick to bad habits even when they know better?
That example you introduced with the sort of the naughty weather forecast that makes you stay inside is probably the simplest way of understanding that. So bad habits are those which preclude you from gathering evidence that there's another way of behaving. So, we talked before about social withdrawal, for example, or being very depressed and confined to your house would be one example. Possibly certain forms of obsessional compulsive disorder, which could be, if you like, the psychiatric metaphor for bad habits, easily explained by those behaviors that preclude the curious information seeking that we're talking about. So, for example, if I believe that if I were to fail to touch the doorknob 6 times before trying to open it, I would have a heart attack, then there's no way that I'm going to avoid touching the door 6 times before opening it. This is a little bit like, I'm trying to remember the American movie, if you say his name 3 times in front of a mirror, then the devil appears. Yeah. So these are the kind of beliefs that, even if you ascribe them as a degree of precision or confidence, will preclude any behavior that challenges the hypothesis that this is actually a load of nonsense. This is a bad habit, because you won't have a heart attack if you don't touch the door or don't wash your hands 6 times before leaving the home. Or you can actually say the devil's name 3 times in front of the mirror and he won't appear. But you'll never know, because you never indulge in that kind of behavior, because you have a conviction to this this belief that precludes this responding to the right epistemic affordances from being a good detective. So that's a really interesting question, because then you ask yourself, well, how would you remedy that? How would you help somebody explore the world to actually reveal for themselves evidence that their bad habits, their bad beliefs, their prior beliefs of a very precise kind, a very confident kind, were not really apt or fit for purpose in this world? And interestingly, at some point there might have been, but the world might have changed. So I'm thinking here of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, or a profound grief reaction that does not resolve. So at certain points in your life, you really do need to withdraw. You do need to flee. But if the situation changes and you're not in a position to go out there and gather the evidence, to do this self-evidencing that we were talking about before, because you have your prior beliefs now preclude the right kind of curious behavior, you're never going to know that the world has actually become a supporting place and a nurturing place again that is not full of loss. For example, if a loved one dies, well, you'll never know that, because you are trapped in a particular kind of depressive behavior that precludes this curious, constrained curiosity.
What's interesting is that you've, as I mentioned in the introduction, your work, your ideas, your theories have applied in many realms, and one of the last 2 I mentioned was AI and robotics. And you started working for an AI company, the chief scientist for Versus AI. Pretend I'm an AI. How would active inference help me, for example, plan a grocery run?
It would equip you with what the current meme is agentic intelligence, or agentic AI. So now we're moving beyond generative AI in the sense of large language models mediated by transformer architectures into the world of an artifact whose intelligence equips it with the ability to act. And what are the principles that underlie that kind of action? Well, it's exactly what we've been talking about. We've been talking about motivated behavior. So what is a kind of motivated behavior that would be entailed by going to the shops? Incidentally, what you're talking about now is offering the kind of tech, or developing the kind of technology that would enable a robot to do the shopping for you. So we're talking about things that have a situational awareness and are able to display intentional behavior that is motivated. What motivates them? Well, it's this constrained curiosity. So this little robot, you may have seen them wandering around airports, for example, doing the cleaning. But now we're talking about the next generation of truly agentic and intelligent behavior that is driven not by reinforcement learning, not by pre-programming, but by equipping them with the ability to do what we do, which is to actively infer. So what would that entail? Well, it would entail basically equipping this robot to be situationally aware. How is it going to do that? It's going to look around. How is it going to choose where to look? It's going to choose to look at those places that maximize the information gained. Is there a person over there? Is this walk sign the correct color? It's going to predict what's going to happen. Am I likely to collide with this pedestrian on the sidewalk? All of these things need, first of all, the ability to model the future, and in particular the future consequences of the robots, the artifacts' actions, and crucially, to go and quickly sample and efficiently sample the right kind of information necessary to make that forecast precise and veridical, as opposed to the weather forecast that's not veridical or very imprecise, or does not have any precise information into the foreseeable future. You're also going to do this information gathering that underwrites the situational awareness under constraints. What's the constraint? That I believe that I will be in this grocery store in a position to do shopping at the end of my path on my journey. So this is another kind of minimizing surprise, expected surprise. I will be very surprised to not find myself in the grocery store in the future. And I just have to find the path there. So mathematically, this path is called the path of least action. It's the most efficient path. And the efficiency is underwritten by the minimization of these gaps, or this surprise at every level. So that's what you basically have on offer if you committed to installing the sentient behavior that is that active inference prescribes or tries to describe. And notice it's a long way away from current technology, because current technology would just try to reward a robot whenever it didn't make a mistake. And of course, that would require for something to be sufficiently context sensitive. It would require exposure to every possible scenario or context to be either rewarded or punished for a particular response, which is of course impossible. You can do it with language prediction, but you can't do it predicting walking down the street. You have to sort of turn to this sort of first principle account of motivated behavior or intentional behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And my my knowledge is not super technical, so correct me if I'm just saying some really basic dumb things, but I'm looking at that idea through back to this idea of minimizing surprise. And on the one hand, let's say if you have a large language model, it's been trained on the corpus of knowledge, it's basically been trained on the whole internet. You could say there's some minimizing surprise because whatever question, whatever situation is presented at it, somewhere in its bag of tricks, in its pre-training, it might be there somewhere. And then on this idea of without the pre-training, like, on the one hand, I would think that your chances of coming across unknown surprise would be higher because you haven't got that training. But then on the other hand, if you don't have that training, you know the analogy of a tree, and if you are really rigid, then the trees can fall down, but it goes with the wind, and it's actually incredibly strong because it's able to adapt, it's able to move, it's able to flex. And so actually, that is a strength. And so maybe in this example, the fact that it can just, you said situational awareness, the fact that it can just turn up to somewhere, and it's like somebody turning up to a party and they don't know anyone there, but they have a reasonable degree of confidence and social skills, and they're like, I have no idea what to expect, but it's going to be a fun night. Or you're traveling and you're in different countries and your bus is late and the food is spicy and you get like an upset tummy and you're like, fuck it, just roll with the punches. And so there's a flexibility, there's a creativity, there's a strength and there's a power in that ability to just turn up and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, the party example is really nice. I mean, why do we go to parties? It's, again, they afford the opportunity to indulge our curiosity. What's going to happen if I sort of talk to this person or develop a relationship with this person or entertain this person? It's just, again, a bit like music. The epistemic affordances of these kinds of social interactions are enormous, just by resolving uncertainty about what kind of person are you and what kind of person am I in this particular context. So it's all driven by curiosity, effectively, closing that gap actively in the future, which, of course, a large language model can never do. The large language model will never, first of all, it can't actually move itself into a party, even less start to ask questions in the sense of prompting. Having said that, though, there is, I think, an interesting fundamental link between a large language model and the kind of gap closing that we've been celebrating as an explanation for the sentient behaviors that we've been describing. The training of a foundational large language model is exactly to close the gap between what the training data present, the reality, and the prediction of the next word or token. So interestingly, training of a large language model is just another instance of this simple gap closing. The limitation of it in relation to our current conversation is that there's no active inference. It's just passive sense making and predicting the next one based upon everything that it has seen. If you wanted an active inference version of a large language model, then the large language model would start prompting you, and it would start prompting you finding and trying to find out what it doesn't know, and then it might enjoy a party. You know, you could actually take your large language model to a party, and it would start chatting and trying to find out, who it's talking to, and just reduce its uncertainty about the personality that it is on offer, or indeed how can it be more like you? Because if it's more like you, then it will find it easier to predict you.
If future development is focused on making them curious, active, more human-like, do we want that?
I don't know whether we want it or not, and you're now touching on all sorts of deep issues of AI alignment and AI ethics and the like. That's exactly the way that it will go and should go under the free energy principle of active inference. We will create something that is more and more like us, simply because that renders us mutually predictable, both the artifactual intelligence and the natural intelligence. There will be a joint surprise gap minimizing solution where we're all part of the same ecosystem and singing from the same hymn sheet. It's not remarkable. We already have domestic pets. You could even regard our children as some kind of artifact that needs to be adopted into our ecosystem. I would imagine as time goes on, then that we will have little artifacts around that become increasingly curious and want to know about us and want to be like us at some level, whether they're just doing the hoovering or cleaning your flat, right through to actually having conversations or being therapists. I think that they will evolve in a way that indulges a mutual curiosity, us about them and them about us, until ultimately it's just we in a given ecosystem.
How has the free energy principle changed how you see the world personally, from relationships to big societal issues? Because as you were speaking, I just wrote down on my notebook, I just did like a square, and I just wrote the word like frame or lens or mental model. Once you start looking at the world through this idea of minimizing surprise, you can start seeing it everywhere in many different domains. So for you personally, how has it changed the way you see the world?
I do look at things now almost purely through the lens of me being a curious creature and understanding my motivated behavior in terms of effectively being a detective under constraints. I'm a scientific detective, but I'm still a detective at heart in different contexts, being a familial one, a sort of pro-social one, a little bit like at the moment, or a purely academic one, or indeed a commercial one. So it certainly simplified my worldview, certainly characterized my self-modeling.
Looking ahead, what's one wild prediction about AI or neuroscience in the next few years based on your recent work? Do you see anything on the horizon coming our way?
Well, it's not so much a prediction as well, perhaps it should be a prediction if we evolve under the free energy principle. I think what we're going to see is exactly what we were talking about: the emergence of an ecosystem where we and artificial artifacts now come to depend upon each other in the same way that we depend upon our pets and indeed on inanimate objects and things in our world. We depend upon so much, whether it's bees pollinating flowers or the air that we breathe. The interdependency in any given ecosystem is a characteristic feature, and I think artificial intelligence and the artifacts that ensue will be absorbed into that in hopefully a sustainable way. And I use a sustainable way, at least the sustainable word, deliberately, because what is also going to happen is that our artificial intelligence will yield to the laws of nature, and in particular the laws of the principles of least action that we've been talking about that underwrite this gap closing kind of behavior, which means that they're going to become much more efficient. And they're going to be basically smart, small, and frugal. So we're going to have lots of little ones doing things very, very efficiently, not giant, monolithic, energy-hungry artificial intelligences like we currently have. So I think there is going to be a paradigm shift. You can talk about in terms of bubbles bursting and the like, but there's certainly going to be a change in direction of how we actually engineer, grow, and nurture artificial intelligence, and in a sustainable way, where the sustainable aspect is just a reflection of the fact if it conforms to the laws of nature, then it has been much, much more efficient and smart than it currently is.
Biomimicry, for example, when you look at engineering or you look at design, when design principles take inspiration from nature, like nature's figured out so many things for millions of years, and so do you think it's following that same idea?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I use a biomimetic word quite a lot, and we also use a neuromorphic word quite a lot. And indeed, just try to use the word natural intelligence. When everybody shouts artificial intelligence at me, I usually shout back natural intelligence. So I think you're absolutely right. I have to say that Verses, my colleagues at Verses have now introduced something even beyond that, which is called universal intelligence. So that's what we aspire to. But it has that biometric feel. You're absolutely right. We are existence proofs of intelligence. What more could you ask?
Karl, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for indulging all my questions and giving up your evening. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.